Okay, so good morning. Today is Shiva B'Tammuz, so I wanted to choose a topic which is, of course, pertinent to the time. We've now begun the period of the 3 weeks. It's a difficult period of time, but I want to share some ideas with you, some very illuminating ideas, which I think you'll find of tremendous relevance and hopefully inspiration. The reasons for the Churban, we now begin Shiva B'Tammuz. The Mishnah in Tanis sets out exactly what we're commemorating today, and ultimately it's leading to sort of intensifying the mourning from now through till Tisha B'Av. And Tisha B'Av is a day of the Churban, by Rishon and by Sheni. Take a look at the Gemara in Nedarim, Pei Aleph Amud Aleph. Take a look at the first box. The Gemara says in Nedarim, Amar Rav Yehuda Amar Rav, Mai Dichsiv, Mi ha'ish hechacham v'yavnei zeis. The Gemara says in the Nedarim, the pasuk in Yirmiyah says, Mi ha'ish hechacham v'yavnei zeis. Who is the wise man who can understand this? Davar zeh nishel lechachamim v'leneviim v'lo pirshuhu. This question was asked to the chachamim and the neviim, and they couldn't figure it out. In other words, at the time of the Churban, they didn't know why the Beis Hamikdash has been destroyed. Ad shepirshu HaKadosh Baruch Hu ba'atzmai. The Nevi'im, the Chachomim didn't know. Can you imagine? They didn't understand why there was a Churban until HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself had to explain it. Tichsiv hayom Hashem al ozvam es teirasi. And what was the answer? Hashem said, because they forsook my Torah. Omer Rav Yehuda, the Gemara there continues and says, she'ein mevarchin b'Torah tchila. It doesn't mean they forsook Torah, but they just didn't say Birchas HaTorah. So, this is a very perplexing Gemara. The whole Churban happened because they didn't say Birchas HaTorah. The Rabbeinu Yoina asks the seemingly obvious fact that Al Ozvam es Teirasi, that they forsook my Torah. Pasha Pshat is they didn't keep Torah. So if that was the case, how could that have eluded the Chacham and the Nevi'im? Isn't that obvious? If you see people who have abandoned the Masorah, they're not keeping Torah anymore, then why were the Chacham and Nevi'im scratching their heads and saying, hey, why is there a Churban? Is it not obvious? So the first question is, why is it, with the Pshat in the Pasuk, Al Ozmes Teirasi, how could that have eluded the Chacham and the Nevi'im? Number one. Number two, if the Gemara means that what doesn't really mean Ozmes Teirasi, but it means that they didn't say Birchas HaTorah properly, then that seems also very strange. Why does not saying Birchas HaTorah warrant a heavy punishment? Now I get it. Birchas HaTorah is a deraisa. I understand that. But again, so they didn't say Birchas HaTorah. Does that warrant the whole Churban? And the Churban, when we commemorate this period of time leading to Tisha B'Av, it's really an opportunity to commemorate all tragedies in the Jewish world. And that's what we do on Tisha B'Av. We go through the kinnis and we commemorate all the many tragedies throughout Jewish history. So because of not saying Birchas HaTorah, it seems a very heavy punishment. And that Lamais is the question of the Bach. If you take a look on the second box, if you're listening online, please email me at j.golker@gmail.com. I'll send you the handout. Look at the second box. V'ikalit tmaya tuva. I've got a very strong question. Says the Bach. Lama yotza kazeis milefanav la'anishim ba'inish gadol v'ram kazeh. Why such a heavy punishment? Al shelo baruchu b'Torah tchila shulechayra avera kalis, seemingly relatively small avera, and it's like a sledgehammer for a walnut. Third question, very seemingly obvious question. How can the Gemara in Nedarim say that the reason for Churban is because they didn't say Birchas HaTorah? The Gemara in Yuma says a different reason. The Gemara in Yuma says that the first Beis Hamikdash was destroyed because of the three big ones. The transgression of the Gimel Averis Chamurais, Avodah Zarah, Gileras, and Shvichas Damim. Says the Gemara in Yuma Daf Tes on Beis, Migdash Rishon Mipnei Macharav, Mipnei Shleisha Dvarim Shahayu Ba'Avodah Zarah, Gileras, and Shvichas Damim. And question number 4, if indeed Al Ozmes Teirasi refers to not saying Birchas HaTorah, where do you see that in the Pasuk? Where in the Pasuk do you see that it refers to the failure to make the bracha rather than the abandonment of Torah itself? So 4 strong questions. Question number 1, according to Gemara Nedarim, the Chacham and the Nevi'im couldn't figure out why there was a Churban. If it's Al Ozmes Teirasi, that's an obvious transgression. How could that have eluded the Chacham and the Nevi'im? Question number 2, if according to the Gemara in the Nedarim, it doesn't actually mean abandonment of Torah, but it means not saying Birchas HaTorah, why does that warrant such a heavy punishment? Question number 3, how does this tally with the Gemara in Yuma, which says it's because of the violation of the Gimel Averos Chamuras? And question number 4, where in the Pasuk Al Osmes Teirasi that do we see that it refers to not saying Birchas HaTorah? So, the Ran gives a famous answer in the name of the Rabbeinu Yonah there in the Nedarim. I want to explore that a little bit more because I think it gives a very, very important message for life generally. Let's take a look at the Rabbeinu Yonah. This is the paragraph 2, box number 4. Elevadai asukin hoy b'Torah tamid. It must be, says the Ran, in the name of the Rabbeinu Yonah, that they were keeping Torah. And that's why the Chacham and Nevi'im couldn't figure it out. What's going on? Everyone's going to shul, everyone's keeping kosher, we're keeping Shabbos, we're wearing tefillin, we're wearing tzitzis. What is the problem? Until HaKadosh Baruch Hu himself came along, he knew the depths of our hearts, that they didn't say Birchas HaTorah. Koloma, what does that mean? That the Torah wasn't important. It lacked chashivas. That people, it wasn't necessary to make a bracha on it. They weren't engaged in it altruistically. And therefore, not saying Birchas HaTorah is a representation of the fact that they weren't valuing Torah sufficiently. What does that mean? I'll give you an anecdote which brings the point out. You know, Noach Weinberg was the great Rosh Hashiva of Eish HaTorah. The man has he sadly passed away a few years ago. He has, immeasurable zuchusim. He ultimately started with others, Or Sameach and Eish HaTorah, and the catalyst of the Tshuva movement, a lot of it is to his credit. He had an interesting halachic problem. See, the way it would work, back in the late 60s, 70s, 80s, he would encourage people who came to visit Yerushalayim in the old city, they would go to the Kosel, and there would be people there who were searching. And there would be tzaddikim who would bring them back to the Eish HaTorah building, and he would give shiurim to people who had, it was their first ever exposure to authentic Torah classes. And they would come into the Beis HaMedrash there in Or Sameach, or in Eish HaTorah, and Rabbi Noach Weinberg was going to give them a shiur. And there is a halachic problem he's encountering, because these people have not said Birchas HaTorah. If they haven't said Birchas HaTorah, how can you teach Torah to someone who hasn't said Birchas HaTorah yet? We know that before we get up after we get up in the morning, before we learn Torah, we have to wash Negel Vasa. And before, I always feel it strange sometimes that boys come to school, and boys like yourselves, fantastic boys in the Beis HaMedrash, and they could be traveling for half an hour, and they come to school and they say Birchas HaTorah. So what were you doing on the bus? What were you doing on the way here? Daydreaming, sleeping, maybe. But is it not an opportunity of a v'lechtoch avaderech to learn a little bit? I have a friend who, when he came back from yeshiva, this is going back a number of years, in his commutes in university, he studied whatever he studied, I forget, but he finished Shas Mishnayos. Just a couple of Mishnayos, one or two a day, but it builds up. He used the time. So he's got Noach Weinberg's got a problem. How does he deal with it? And then there are halachic rash sort of justifications that you don't need to for people, but he did. What did he do? He said the following: my dear friends, we are about to embark on the study of Torah. Torah is not history, it's not physics, it's not chemistry, it's not mathematics. It's the Word of God. And before we embark on studying Torah, we need to make a blessing. And he basically said Birchas HaTorah for them. Now, I think he did that for two reasons. Number one, to avoid the halachic problem that I mentioned. And number two, to convey, perhaps subliminally, the idea that Torah is just different. It's not an academic study. It's Kihem Chayenu V'Erech Yomeinu. Not saying Birchas HaTorah is a manifestation of the lack of value of that idea. It's just relegated to a regular study. And therefore, says Rabbeinu Yonah, the explanation of the Gemara in Nedarim is that they didn't value Torah, and that is represented by not saying Birchas HaTorah. Now, what exactly is the root of the problem? What exactly was not saying Birchas HaTorah? What was going on in the time of Churban Bayis Rishon? So, I want to share with you an idea I once heard from Rabbi Zev Leff. He said the following. Picture the following. Imagine you're seeing from outer space planet Earth. We've all seen images of that. Now, put yourself on planet Earth and you're looking out to the big sky. Imagine there is a globe around this big ball, this big globe around planet Earth. And you cut out 613 windows that you can see through into outer space. Says Rabbi Leff, essentially, that is what a mitzvah is. When you look out through that window and you put on the tefillin, looking through the mitzvah of the window of tefillin, that is the mitzvah of tefillin. The word mitzvah is lashon of tzav. Tzav is a line. It's a connector. The way we connect HaKadosh Baruch Hu is doing mitzvahs, and there are 613 windows of doing it. Ultimately, doing mitzvahs is meant to connect us to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and to make us live with the awareness and realization that He's very present in our lives. The Rashi says famously, when Yaakov meets Esav, he says, Im lovon harosha garti v'tayag mitzvahs shamarti v'lo lamadati mimaisim horoim. That I was there with Lavan, a wicked man, and I learned Torah and I kept mitzvahs, I didn't learn from his evil ways. And everyone asks, well, the last few words are redundant. If you kept Taryag mitzvahs, then obviously, so what are you adding, Yaakov Avinu? If you kept 613 mitzvahs, then obviously you didn't learn from his evil ways. The answer is this, and it's a bit of a scary answer, that it's possible to keep 613 commandments and not be connected to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to be a very average or even worse person. Because sometimes we're just going through the motions. Because when you lose sight of the bigger picture, and you don't appreciate that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is very much there, then we're going through the motions. Moshe Lamar David Doimeh. That, we say Tehillim after Shacharis every day. Still, for the situation here at Israel, we should hear Besuras Tovas. But we've been doing it for nearly 2 years. And it's hard to do so with the same fervor and kavanah as we did in the initial stages. And many a time, myself included, my mind wanders when we're saying Shir HaMalos Eso'ena Neharim, and we're perhaps even wrapping up our tefillin, and we're thinking about the day ahead. And we're going through the motions, the words are coming out, they're coming out of our mouths, but we're not thinking, we're not feeling it. That's the point. That it's possible to go through the motions and to lose sight of the bigger picture. They tell a famous story of Shraga Feivel Mendelovitz. Shraga Feivel was the Torah pioneer of the 20th century. He started many of the great yeshivas in America, of course, of Torah Vadas, and he, not only that, he took boys and he started up this sort of small, with a core, a nucleus of young men, outstanding young men. He managed to set up other yeshivas. He was an architect. He was the founder of the Torah Masorah Day movement. And he really is one of the real pioneers of the resurgence of orthodoxy, of Torah life in America in the 20th century. One time, Rav Shraga Feivel Mendelovitz was away for Shabbos, and he was out of town, and he knew that he had a Talmud, a former student, who was living in that place. So he got in touch with him and he said, listen, I'm going to be in this town, could I come to you for a Shabbos meal? And the Talmud was delighted. His Rosh Yeshiva, Rav Shraga Feivel, was going to come. Wow. Now, he was a young man, a few young kids. His wife was exhausted, sleep deprived, as is the lot often of the bracha of children, is exhausting, Baruch Hashem. And this young man wasn't the most helpful of husbands. So Erev Shabbos, the house looked chaotic, as often houses do on Erev Shabbos with young children. And there was a lot of things to do still. You got to get the kids ready for Shabbos. You got to set the table still. There was cooking to do. There was a lot of stuff to do still. And instead of rolling up his sleeves and helping, he just said, "Don't forget, the Rosh Yeshiva is coming tonight." And he goes off to shul, and the wife sits there and looks around. This is chaotic. This is how am I going to get there in time? There's so much to do, and I've got to deal with the kids. I've got to set the table, finish off. It's going to take a long time. And she was so exhausted, sleep deprived. She says, "I'm going to sit down on the settee and have a power nap, and hopefully that will give me a bit of koyach, and I'll be able to finish off." She sits down on the settee, and she falls into a deep sleep. And she's awoken only an hour and a half later, a knock at the door, her husband and the Rosh Yeshiva standing at the front door. And if the house looked bad an hour and a half ago, now it looked like a bomb site. And Shraga Feivel came in and realized exactly what had happened. And the husband, his blood was boiling. If the Rosh Yeshiva wasn't there, he'd be screaming and shouting. Not the greatest of Bal Midas. And the wife was so embarrassed, startled, and the house was chaotic. So between all of them, they started clearing up and putting the stuff away, and then setting the table. And the husband was his blood was boiling, sort of containing himself, not to let loose. And eventually, 20 minutes later, things were a bit more orderly. The games that were thrown all over the floor had been put away. The table was set, and then the husband's about to make kiddush. And he notices that the challah decal is not on the challahs. And that is the proverbial straw that breaks the camel's back. And he suddenly starts shouting to his wife, "Don't you know you got to cover the challahs? We do this every week." Nebuch embarrassing this poor young wife in front of the Rosh Yeshiva, in front of the kids. What terrible behavior. And Rosh Feivel reflected on that afterwards and thinking, what an irony. Why do we cover the challahs? One of the reasons why we cover the challahs is that we shouldn't embarrass the challah. Because really, the challah, the bracha for the challah should come first. But you don't make the bracha on hamoitzi until you've made kiddush, so therefore you make ber pragofen first, and then you make hamoitzi. So not to embarrass the challah, that you shouldn't see that the wine is getting first, so we cover it. Not to embarrass the challah. Have you ever seen an embarrassed challah? Sometimes one of your sisters perhaps could leave the Shabbos table, storm away, and slam a bedroom door. Maybe maybe that could happen. But an embarrassed challah, obviously, is meant to teach us kavod habrius, to respect other people, and that had gone straight over his head. So he's screaming at his wife, "Why didn't you cover the challah?" What an irony! Because what's the sheresh hadava? The root is that if you take HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of the picture, if you lose sight of the bigger picture, then it's a very, very dangerous slippery slope. And that's exactly what's going on in Churban Bayis Rishon. It starts with not saying Birchas HaTorah. Birchas HaTorah simply means they didn't value what Torah is. They were going through the motions like robots, and it was just by rote, but they weren't seeing the bigger picture of the HaKadosh Baruch Hu in there. And therefore, it starts with that, and it ends up at the bottom of the slippery slope with violation of the Gimel Averos Chamuras. So that's what the Gemara in Yuma means. So ask the Bach, is not saying Birchas HaTorah is such a big deal? The answer is yes. Because it just is another way of saying, I'm going through the motions and I'm not seeing HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the picture. And if you don't see the big picture, it's a very dangerous slippery slope. That's why the Gemara says, the Pasuk says in Yeshaya, look at the bottom box, Vayom Hashem yan ki nigash ha'amozeh b'fivu v'sfosov kibduni v'libay richak mimeni. They're going through the motions, they're saying the words, but their hearts are so far from me. V'tirosom iti mitzvahs anoshim elumoda. They're just going through the motions. Rabbi Leff also tells a story of one time, he was a young Rav in Miami, and one time he gets a call a few days before Yom Kippur, and an old lady from the community says, "Rabbi, you got to help me. What's the problem? My husband is not well, and he's insisting on fasting on Yom Kippur. The doctors have told him it's dangerous, he can't do it. And he's not listening to me. So Rabbi Lev says, okay, let me try and speak to him. He verifies with the doctors, and he definitely needs to eat. He cannot fast. And he calls the fellow, they arrange a meeting, he goes round to the man, and Rabbi Lev says to him, I understand that the doctors have told you to eat on Yom Kippur. And this fellow picks himself up. He says, listen, Rabbi, I know you've come to persuade me, but I want to tell you, I am 3 times your age. I have not missed fasting on Yom Kippur for the past 70 years, and no one is going to tell me to eat on Yom Kippur. So you're a young Rav, what do you do? So Rabbi Lev looked at him and said, look, I understand where you're coming from, but I just want to tell you that if you insist on fasting this Yom Kippur, I will never give you an aliyah again in my shul. You should live and be well, but you will never get an aliyah in my shul. The guy was a bit taken back. Why not? He says, because I don't give aliyahs to idol worshippers. Idol worshipper? Why am I an idol worshipper? He said, look, the halacha is very clear. You have got to eat on Yom Kippur. If you insist on fasting, I don't know who's telling you to fast. Maybe it's an idol called Zeus, maybe it's called Baal, maybe it's an idol called Yom Kippur. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu is telling you, you must eat. Now, what is the underpinning of this story? The underpinning is exactly the same thing. If a person asks, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from me? What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from me? If a person goes through life living like that, he won't go too far wrong. This gentleman, we have sympathy for him. But he's taking HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of the picture. He's fasting on Yom Kippur because that's what he always does. But the question is, what does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from me? This year, HaKadosh Baruch Hu wants him to eat. That's the point. The Gemara in Yuma says in Daf Chaf Gimel Amud Aleph, there were people one time, they were running up the kevesh. They used to have running races to figure out who would do certain things in the Avodah. And the Gemara says, two people were running, they were going up the ramp. One guy was getting there and he was going to win the race. The other guy took out a dagger and thrust it in the other guy's heart. For what? So that he shouldn't win the race, that I can do the avodah to serve HaKadosh Baruch Hu? When you read the Gemara, it sounds crazy. But that's another manifestation of the problem. You're going through the motions. That is exactly, we asked 4 questions. The questions were, number 1, how could that have eluded the Chacham and the Nevi'im? The answer is because everyone was going to shul, everyone was eating kosher, everyone was putting on tefillin, everyone was keeping Shabbos, but they were losing sight of the bigger picture. They were going through the motions. That's why it eluded the Chachamim. And that's why Birchas HaTorah doesn't seem, why does it warrant such a heavy punishment? Because it's a manifestation of this problem. Why? How does that reconcile with the Gemara in Yuma? That it was a violation of the Gimel Averos Chamuros? The answer is it starts with not saying Birchas HaTorah, with not seeing the big picture, with cutting HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of the picture, and it's a slippery slope down to even the Gimel Averos Chamuros. Where do you see it in the Pasuk? The answer is because the Pasuk says, V'lo yishamu b'koili al ozum es teiros si, they didn't see me. V'lo yishamu b'koili, they took me out of the picture. And all of this is symbolized in Birchas HaTorah. What do we say? Asher kitshonu b'mitzvosov, the whole purpose of Torah is to make us holy. Yodei Hashemecha, to know and to emulate HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and to develop a complete Torah personality. And Asher bocha bonu mikol ha'amim, we're chosen to be a nation of Kohanim and holy people. Interestingly, the 3 weeks always sort of ends, Sefer Bamidbar begins Sefer Devarim. Sefer Devarim, the first 3 sedras, is a preamble. Sefer Devarim essentially is a long speech. Moshe Rabbeinu's exhortations to the Jewish people, his parting words, a 40-day speech. And no mitzvahs appear until Parshas Re'eh. So Devarim, V'eschanon and Ekev are just the preamble to Sefer Devarim. But amazingly, Moshe Rabbeinu's parting message to them is to remain loyal to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and he first speaks about Yiras Shamayim. That's what Parshas Devarim V'Eschanan on Ekev Ridiyah, just exhorting the Jewish people to have Yiras Shamayim, because that is the underpinning for mitzvahs. If a person keeps mitzvahs and goes through the motions without the underpinning of Yiras Shamayim, you're in big trouble. And you see that pattern elsewhere. The key is to live a life with HaKadosh Baruch Hu very much in the picture. The Nesiva Shalom in Bamidbar and Bein HaMetzarim, penultimate box on the page, says a very beautiful thing. Take a look. Hine, Tachlis Brias Shel Yehudi. The purpose of the creation of a Jew, He sheyeh dovuk b'Hashem, is that he should have a closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'zeh hoya kol inyan shel Beis HaMikdash. That is really the function of the Beis HaMikdash. Shenis'ave HaKadosh Baruch Hu liyos ledir b'tachtoinim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to have a residence down in this world. K'moi dichsiv v'asur l'mikdash v'shachanti b'soicham. Hainu b'toich kol echad v'echad. HaKadosh Baruch Hu wanted to live in this world in the hearts of every single person. Sh'al yidei Beis HaMikdash niyeh dovuk b'Hashem. Really, when we're struggling in Golus 2,000 years later, we're so distant from the life of what a Beis HaMikdash was. But really the desire, the purpose, the objective of a Beis HaMikdash was to have that closeness with HaKadosh Baruch Hu, to live a life with a recognition of His very presence. That's what we're lacking. That's really what the Churban is. It always seems a bit of an anomaly, and I'll finish with this, that we've got a week and a half left of school. The summer is in the air. We're thinking holidays. And yet, we're starting the period of the 3 weeks. How do we, balance the two? So I'll tell you something astonishing. The purpose of summer holidays is to recharge, to rebuild. I'll tell you an amazing Maisa. A story happened, there's a fellow in Golders Green. His name is Gerald Halibard. An amazing fellow. He's a surveyor. I think he's still working. The following story happened with him. I've spoken to him, I verified this story. This happened a long time ago, 20, 30 years ago. Gerald Halibard was a surveyor, working man. It was a Friday afternoon, he was coming back from work. He was a special fellow, I'm sure he was doing Shnai Mikra on the train on the way back from the central of London, going back into Golders Green. As he got onto the train somewhere in central London, a non-Jewish lady, comes in the train. It was the end of the day, and she sits opposite him. And he sees that she looks very tired. And indeed, when she sits down, she puts her bag down next to her, and as the train moves on, she falls into a deep sleep. The rattle of the train helps. He's sitting there learning, and carries on. You know what it's like, you're on the underground. As soon as you get out from that long stop from Hampstead, as you get towards Golders Green, it comes out from the underground and it emerges into daylight. Golders Green Station, a few minutes before Golders Green Station. Suddenly, as the train emerged, there was like a bright light, and it startled her, and she emerged from a deep sleep of 30 minutes. And she didn't know where she was. All of a sudden, it took a moment or two to come to, by which time the train had stopped, the doors opened, and she realized this is a stop. She quickly jumped up, ran out of the train, and the train doors closed, and as the train was pulling away, she realized she had left a bag on the train. And the last thing she saw was this Jewish man, Gerald Halibard, walking towards her bag. End of part one. Gerald Halibard gets off at Brent Station, the next stop, takes the bag, and realizes he's got a mitzvah for Shabbos Aveda, but it's Shabbos soon. He makes a mental note to try and track down this lady after Shabbos. He has to go home, shower, get ready for Shabbos. Motzei Shabbos, straight after Havdalah, he opens the bag, he somehow manages to find who she is, he calls the lady. And he says to her, were you on a train on Friday? Yeah. Oh my gosh, are you the guy with the bag? Oh my, thank you so much. I've been waiting for this phone call. Can I come around and pick it up? Pleasure. He gives his address. She comes around a short while later. She comes round and he gives her the bag and she gives him a bottle of wine. This is to thank you. He looks at the wine. If it was me, I would have said thank you very much. He looks at the bottle of wine and he sees it's a kosher bottle of wine. He says to her, where did you get this from? All the stores are shut today. It's Saturday. It was Shabbos today. This is what she said. She said, when I saw a religious Jew walking towards my bag, I knew that he was taking it in order to return it to me. In anticipation of the call you made 20 minutes ago, I went to the store Friday afternoon to buy a bottle of wine to thank you. That's a Kiddush Hashem. And that really is the function of a summer holiday. Look at this. Look at this. We all said this yesterday afternoon, Shabbos Mincha. Ato echad. Listen carefully to this. I once told this to someone, I say this almost every year to every graduating class. And a boy came up to me not so long ago, a few months ago. He said to me that because of this idea, he hasn't, this kavana goes through his mind every time he davens Shabbos Mincha. Listen to this. Ato echad v'shimcha echad. We say in Shabbos Mincha in the afternoon. Yom menucha kedusha l'amcha nosata, Avraham, Yogel, Yitzchak, Yiran, and Yaakov on Yenuchavai. We make reference to different types of menucha. Listen carefully. Menuchas avon adova. Why does a person go on holiday? One of three reasons. Different types of menucha. Menuchas avon adova. To spend time with loved ones, with family, with close friends. Menuchas emes ve'emuna. Alternatively, we need time to rest, to recharge spiritual batteries. It's an opportunity to learn a bit more, to daven a bit better. And thirdly, menuchas shalom v'hashav v'hashke tovetach. We sometimes just want to chill out. We're exhausted after a long year, we're tired, we're burnt out. We need to just recharge the physical batteries. All beautiful types of menuchas. Menuchas avon adava, to spend time with family, to recharge spiritual batteries, to recharge physical, emotional batteries. All wonderful. So long as al menuchasam yagdishu Hashemecha. So long as that menucha will lead to a Kiddush Hashem. And a Kiddush Hashem can be anywhere, anytime. The Chavetz Chaim famously says, Ki ha'mokom asher ta'omed olav ad mas kodeshu. Says the Chavetz Chaim, with Matan Torah, Moshe Rabbeinu goes up to Har Sinai, the mokom asher ta'omed olav ad mas kodeshu, the place, says the Chavetz Chaim, that any time, any place has the potential to be ad mas kodesh. And that really is what the Rabbeinu Yonah is referring to. The Churban, all the four questions we asked, the underpinning is we have to live a life where we see HaKadosh Baruch Hu in the bigger picture. That is what a Kiddush Hashem is. Bring HaKadosh Baruch Hu into our lives. If we go into the summer holiday and we think, we refocus, am I going to live a life which is going to cause a Kiddush Hashem? Then that is the antidote to Golus. That is what brings Moshiach. Because ultimately the Churban happened because we took HaKadosh Baruch Hu out of the picture. There was a Chilul Hashem. We weren't bringing HaKadosh Baruch Hu into our lives. We weren't living with the recognition in our day-to-day living. And therefore, I think we can, if you like, reconcile the period of time we're in and the holiday season which we're about to embark on. But the underlying message of living a life with an awareness, a recognition of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is ultimately the antidote to Golus. Mitzvah Hashem, we should be zocher for those days of Geula to come. Bekar of Mamish, B'mheira of Yomeinu. Amen.